Welcome to our Dig into Hort series called New Management Recommendations for Saskatoon Berry, Haskap, Raspberry, Sour Cherry, and Strawberry. This is part one of a two-part series, and tonight we're dealing with orchard renovation and pruning for Saskatoon's Haskap's raspberry and sour cherry orchards, and we'll briefly touch on black currants as well. My name is Sharon Fay, and I'm the local food coordinator with Leduc County. I'll be one of your hosts, along with a number of other municipalities. So we're privileged to have a team of 4 municipalities working together to host this event. And usually we have one at this time of year in the fall and then in the early winter months. Anything can be anything from regarding horticulture, that is, from planning to production to marketing. So our team consists of Dawn Fortin from Woodlands County, Rebecca Nickerick from Parkland, and Chrysanne Carlson from Sturgeon County, and myself. So as I mentioned before, during the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the session. However, if there's something a burning question, there's some technical term that you didn't quite understand, if you put it in the chat, we'll also watch for that. We might stop our speaker partway just to clarify and then let him continue. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Forrest Scharff, who'll be speaking to us today. I've known Forrest for many years. I used to work in the statistics and economics area, and I'd be phoning people across the prairies, and Forrest was my contact for Saskatchewan to find out what the stats were and what was happening in Saskatchewan regarding the fruit industry. So it's nice to have you tonight. So Forrest is a provincial specialist for fruit crops in Saskatchewan, and he brings a wealth of knowledge to us. He's been working for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture for 18 years. Prior to that, he worked at the Crop Diversification Centre South in Brooks, Alberta, and at the University of Saskatchewan with their fruit program. He's based in Regina, but manages research projects and conducts insect and disease surveys throughout the province. He was born in Edmonton, but grew up in Saskatoon, and his family farm is located in Melfort, Saskatchewan. In September, he and his wife became empty nesters as their youngest son is now studying mechanical engineering at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And in their non-existent spare time, he and his wife became entrepreneurs in 2025 and opened Buffalo Pound Lodge and Squirrely Putt and Play, located at Buffalo Pound Provincial Park, north of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. He's a professional agrologist and serves on the Professionalism and Ethics Committee within the Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists. He is also a member of a few committees and working groups with the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, and is a secretary for the International Association for Plant Biotechnology, which is hosting its Congress in Saskatoon in 2026. And by the way, this is an event that is held only every 4 years, and it was last held in Canada back in 1978 in Calgary. So it'd be quite an honor to have it back in Canada again. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Forrest. I'm going to stop sharing and let him continue on.
Okay. Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me. I just confirmed that I'm not muted or something.
Nope.
Okay, so I didn't know the background of everyone who's going to be listening in tonight, so I kind of did an overview of pruning to begin with, and then I'll dig into some of the stuff that is sort of more recent developments in understanding how to manage larger orchards and that sort of thing. So for the people that are large-scale orchard owners, I hope that there's something in this for you, and then hopefully for those that are sort of just getting into things, there'll be something for you as well. This picture on the front first page of this presentation is located in just 22 kilometers south of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and it's at the Conservation Learning Center. And it is at our Haskap orchard that was established under one of the funding programs under SCAP. So SCAP is the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership Agreement, and it helped fund a lot of these projects that are the basis of what I'm talking about tonight. There's another program which is in Saskatchewan. It's called the Agriculture Demonstration of Practices and Technology, or ADOPT for short. Um, Adopt has smaller budgets, so when you're designing programs for that, you can do sort of 2-year projects, and it's got limited funding, so usually they're not that large. The strategic field program, there's really no budget limit to that, and it can be like 4 years or whatever. So the strategic field program projects are larger, and in general, those are contracted out to people to carry out. The adopt projects I do myself. So um, I'll just get into the sort of pruning theories and reasons for pruning. So when you're thinking about this, and I'm not just specializing in sort of like Saskatoons or Haskap or whatever, I'm talking in general. The reasons for pruning would be when you're establishing, you need to train the new plants. And when I'm thinking about this, I generally talk about, apples, for example, how you want a structure. So you're kind of controlling exactly how it's growing, the height, the size, the shape. And you can do that by pruning specific branches so that they're removed if they're too low, for example, or not at the right angle if the angle needs to be, at more like a 45 degree or a 90 degree, then you want to control that through pruning. So you can make all those adjustments early on so that the plant is going in the right direction. And you want to eliminate or reduce suckers as well. So, and in general, like, as the plant grows, you want to maintain its vigor and plant health. And pruning can help with that for sure. Uh, and also you want to maintain consistent annual fruit production. So sometimes plants will go into sort of like biennial bearing, or they'll produce heavily in one year and then next to nothing in another. And you generally don't want that. You want to even it out so that they sustain high levels of yield, and in general you get better fruit quality, more consistent quality of your fruit in that way. Uh, and also, you can use pruning to delay plant maturity or extend longevity. So it works in different ways, and you can repair damaged plants and rejuvenate old plants. And I'm going to talk about that. Now, in terms of the sort of newer components of it, a large part of the reason for pruning, or some of the aspects of pruning that we consider for commercial orchards relate to mechanical pruning, or mechanical harvesting. So if you look at this, this is an over-the-row mechanical harvester. You drive this right down the orchard rows. And one of the things you can notice, I hope you can see my cursor here. I'm just sort of spinning on the inside of looking out through the mechanical harvester. You can see that at about, a foot off the ground, below that, you're not going to be getting anything, because these little tines spin around and shake, and they cause the plant to drop their berries. And, they fall, and then they're captured, and they move along through the system. If they're too high, which, let's say a Saskatoon berry is a Thiessen variety and it's growing to be 14 feet tall, it's going to get above the entrance way here, and then when it comes through, it'll just kind of force its way, and the top part won't be efficiently harvested because it's kind of an open space. So we want to kind of avoid that. We want to get it so that the plant production is in this medium zone where most of the berries are. And so that's part of the consideration. And if you look at it, with some mechanical harvesters, as they're going through, it can cause damage to the plant. So we want to structure our plants so that this is minimized, so that you're not doing a lot of damage. And that can be controlled through your own, efforts of controlling the growth. Now, there's physiological effects to pruning, and so there's a number of different things that happen, and this relates to growth regulators. So, in general, the top of a plant is where you'll have the what they call the growth apical meristem. That's the top of a tree, and it controls the growth of the other aspects of the plant because of these hormones. So the hormones, if this is the top of the plant, uh, it's saying this is where we want to maintain dominance, and the buds that are below here are going to be inhibited because we're growing upwards in this direction. Now, if you cut that off, which is called heading in pruning terminology, then that signal won't be coming down, and then buds will produce along and create lateral growth, or eventually they'll reestablish a new central leader, for example. So, your pruning can have a massive effect on what the plant does, and so you're kind of in control, and you need to have an objective of to what you want your plant to do over the longer term. And if you're doing too much pruning, it will keep your plant sort of in a juvenile state because you're not getting those flowering buds coming through. You're constantly sort of cutting those off. And also, it has an influence in terms of the ratio of sort of carbohydrates to growth and the roots. So, like, you're not generally pruning roots. So the roots are developing every year and growing larger to support a larger tree. But if you keep on cutting the top off, then that balance between root capacity and the top growth will be disturbed. And you would see that, for example, in apple trees. If you did a heavy pruning in one year, then the next year you're likely to get what they call water sprouts, which would be where you have a lateral branch, and then there's a shoot that just grows straight up. Those generally won't be producing much fruit, and they're kind of useless. So you want to remove those water sprouts, but you don't really want to get into a situation where you're producing a lot of water sprouts. That's where you moderate how much you take off or how much you remove of plant growth in any given year. And so, in general, like, there's different dwarfing effects that can happen from pruning, and it depends on what time of year you do the pruning. So, summer pruning, for example, is going to have the most dwarfing effect, whereas in the spring, that will have the least dwarfing effect. So, depending upon your goals, you can determine when you want to. If you really want to keep your plants smaller, then you could do some summer pruning, but there's other factors to consider if you're thinking about that. It's generally not recommended. Uh, in general, we're looking for summer pruning to be mainly targeting disease material removal and that sort of thing. But again, temporary and localized growth stimulation. So you may cut off the top so that some more laterals grow, or you may, with a young plant, be cutting off the lower growth and just establishing a trunk that's, let's say, 18 inches off the ground before any lateral branches start moving out diagonally. Uh, and then, from there, you don't want branches that are crossing over. You don't want branches that are running parallel, because if you think about the efficiency of fruit production, it kind of is a translation of solar radiation coming down to a space and then being transferred over to fruit production. If you have a branch that's just being shaded out by another branch, it's inefficient. Like, there isn't as much solar radiation that is coming to that, and so the fruit production, the plant itself still needs to support that branch, but it's not doing anything. So it's better to remove those, what I would call superfluous branches, so that the plant is just maximizing its capture of sunlight and the translation of that energy into fruit production. So those are the ways of I think about it, and I suppose there's probably other ways to consider how you're doing it, but you want to create something that is an open canopy and you know captures sunlight, and then yet has fruiting production at the same time. And this picture here is just an apple tree. So, for example, when it was younger, you may have allowed it to grow to a certain height, but then cut off the top, and that would stimulate some side growth. And then you could select which branches would go out so that you can run it along a trellis. And you notice that this is basically a two-dimensional structure. It's not three-dimensional so much. And that allows you to go in and out of rows, maximizing the space for management purposes. Um, when you're establishing in that first dormant season, there's different things that you can do, and it depends on the crop as to what you want. So for some plants, you're not going to touch them. Some you may want to head them to stimulate some lower growth, and I'll get into that as we go through. The training phase, as I say, the second year, you're still working on the framework essentially, but and that can continue from 2 to 5 years. 5 years probably being mainly when you're dealing with apples or that sort of thing. But with some of the smaller species, 2 years, 3 years, you're probably into that training phase completion. And then maintenance phase is just making sure that the structure continues on the way it is and that your flowering and fruiting years are going to maximize production and fruit quality. And like those things are sort of related in the sense that if you have a plant that's just, you know, there's a lot of dead space on the inside. That space, and I think of like for some Haskap or for some Saskatoons that are real dense bushes, uh, you know, from a management perspective, if you're coming along and spraying to control insects or disease, it's really only touching the outside. It's not getting that inside canopy because it's such a dense space. But if you open up the canopy, then there's more airflow, and that makes it less comfortable for insects to thrive and less water. So the humidity is a little bit lower, and that reduces disease, everything else. So they're all kind of connected, and that's why pruning plays an important role in ensuring that you get the productivity that you want and the quality that you want. Then we come to this stage after when the plants are starting to get fully mature and sometimes they get overgrown and growth sort of starts to stagnate. And a lot of times with berry crops, it's the new growth that is producing the most fruit. So you want to try to select for, branches that are going to be producing a lot of new young growth that's producing fruit. If you allow a lot of the older wood to be retained within, the plant canopy, you're sustaining a lot of unproductive wood. So I'll show examples as we go through, but that's what you want to remove is a lot of that old stuff. Now, I talked a little bit earlier when to prune. In general, I like to prune in early spring. It depends on how hardy the plant is. For some plants like Saskatoon berries, and I'm just showing a little bit of disease here. You can see some Saskatoon juniper rust on this berry there, which is a foliar disease that, sorry, a disease that has sort of two life cycles. It goes from the juniper plant, the spores, the juniper will have a teliospore on it. It's a large sort of octopus-like looking orange ugly thing that produces spores, and then winds will carry it to the Saskatoons, and then it sort of cycles through there and will go back to the juniper. If you can sort of cut that step out, then you've reduced the disease titer in your orchard. So that's sort of like when you're doing massive pruning, you can help to eliminate that. Aside from that, you would be using pesticides or other control methods. But in spring, if you're pruning, the plants are dormant, and it won't be long before conditions start to get better, where there's a lot of heat and everything else coming through. So then the plants come out of dormancy, the sap starts flowing, and they can heal right away. Versus with some of the crops that aren't necessarily as hardy, if you do heavy pruning in the fall, sometimes the overwintering, they haven't had a chance to heal or anything. or there's no growth covering that cut part. So that gets subject to a lot of desiccating winds, and the cold temperatures kind of crack things. And so then there's a little bit more damage that can occur as compared to a spring pruning methodology where, there's just no time or very little time for further damage to occur. And then, as the plant comes out of dormancy, it's better. It's able to heal itself before the real growth starts. And at that time, there isn't as much disease or insect, activity. So then there's less chance for um, other problems to occur. But late fall dormant season is also a good time, and it depends on the crop. Some crop, shrubs, it's better in late fall if they're super hardy, and on a large scale, sometimes you don't have an option. You have to do both. You probably even have to do some pruning over winter if you really want to stay on top of things. Uh, that is, if you're not using the drastic methodology that I'm proposing to incorporate with the rejuvenation pruning at the end of my presentation here. Uh, so, late fall dormant season is preferred for grapes, for example, would be an example of that. So they have a heavy spring sap run, so you don't necessarily want to be doing the pruning in spring and have that sort of being overwhelmed. Summer pruning, again, in the prairies or in the drier areas of the prairies at the very least, it can have a very dwarfing effect. So you might not want to be doing your major pruning in the middle of summer, for example. And it delays hardening off of the plants in fall because you're sort of stimulating that juvenile growth, and then the plant will sort of say, okay, hold on, I need to start growing. But, it might be you're getting into September and the plant isn't recognizing the other, triggers like the lower amount of sunlight and everything else. And then you get these cold temperatures that come in and can damage the plant. So just be cognizant of if you're doing heavy summer pruning, you might run into trouble that way. The other thing about summer pruning is that, diseases are at their height, insects are active, and everything else. And sometimes the insects are carrying the disease with them and other things like that. So just be careful that way. This picture is just showing sort of like an older, overgrown orchard that hasn't really been managed. You can see there's weeds growing in there, and there's hawthorn lace bug growing in on the leaves and everything, and it's to a level where it's pretty unmanageable. And in this particular case, in this picture, the folks wanted to be organic, so there's no control that's available. So in these cases, you need to do something that's a little bit more drastic, I would say. um, Now, how much to prune? Again, what season, but generally not more than a quarter of the top growth if you're doing regular maintenance pruning or training or that sort of thing. But it depends on what your goals are. And, I say 1/4, that's the standard amount that's generally given. You can do up to a third if you're not doing something drastic. But when it comes to rejuvenation pruning, we're recommending you do more than that. So the training phase objectives, you want to build a strong framework. You can see like there's different methods and different tools that you can use. So this is just a handheld little pneumatic succateur that you can use that helps so that you don't get, problems with your wrists or things like that. So make sure you've got the right tools, make sure they're sharp. Between cuts, you always want to clean, and so you can use different products to ensure that you're not spreading disease around as you cut from plant to plant or from one part of the plant to another. Um, so, in a tree form, you want to force and select permanent scaffold branches. In this case, in the training phase, in a shrub form, you're mainly selecting canes or the main shoots. So for like Saskatoons, you just want to make sure that you don't have too dense of a bush, and that the best canes are being selected. The other ones you might want to remove. You don't need to do too much in terms of creating scaffold branches and that sort of thing. Now, in that early phase of things, you want to just focus on and encouraging the proper growth structure. Don't worry about what kind of fruit you're going to get, like the quantity of fruit or whatever. Um, yeah. Now you also want to control the row width, especially if your plans are to go for mechanical harvesting down the road. If you're not planning on mechanical harvesting, then fine, you can let the row get a little bit wider. But you still want something in a U-pick where people can get in there and grab at things. It's a little frustrating sometimes if a plant is really large and you can't reach through or grab branches and pull them down, especially when they're getting tall, to try to reach through a canopy that has all kinds of crossing branches. It can actually be a physical hazard, like people can poke their eyes and things like that. So you just want to make sure that it's open and easily accessible for people to get access to the fruit that they want. Um, yeah, so directing growth for desired features, head to develop strong secondary branches, head to reduce or control height and length growth, remove weak and superfluous canes and branches, like I talked about before, remove low branches and twiggy growth. And again, like it depends on what you're looking for, but with some plants, they have a naturally low growth habit. You might want to lift that up because people don't want to be bent over all day trying to pick, or if it's a U-pick situation, or in terms of a mechanical harvester, it's not going to get those low-lying branches. It's not going to get the super tall branches either. So try to keep it in the middle. Um, yeah, here's some examples of these are Saskatoons, and they're just pruned to be, sort of a V-shaped, low-headed um, structure, and that's easy for humans and also easy for mechanical harvesting. Um, and if you look at this one, this is just been pruned in a little different way. You can see how wide the base is. This would be hard for a mechanical harvester to get through because the little, you know, as the tines are going through, they're going to be shaking this outside part, but they're not going to be doing much on the inside. And then it's going to be doing a lot of damage to the branches in here, and it's going to be flopping these around and potentially, doing damage to your fruit as it's coming through too. Um, so yeah, these are just sort of like general things. And for me, what I'm talking about here is more for the sort of smaller scale or potentially you pick growers that you may be interested in. But in terms of for the longer term and for larger growers, you probably don't have the time or you don't want to put out the labor expense to go through all of this in order to achieve your long-term objectives. So like with annual renewal pruning, you can see here, here's a pneumatic pruner and you're down on your knees and you're reaching in to get um, the larger canes that are coming up or shoots that are coming up and removing those because again, this is becoming more of a woody structure as opposed to a fruit productive structure. So those ones get removed and the younger shoots are coming up and they'll be a lot more productive. They're also a little bit more limber, so they run through a machine better. Or for a U-pick, it's easier for people to grab them and pull down to get the fruit off of the taller branches and everything else. So again, that's what you're doing here. You're controlling height growth, maintaining annual productivity, and delaying maturation of the hedge or removing the mature components of the hedge. And then, you keep that going, running sort of, and it depends on the species of plant, but uh, you're running and removing like a quarter, say, of the oldest stems annually, and that's your sort of target. Here's a couple pictures just of different types of equipment. And this one's on a larger pole, and it's attached to your big pneumatic pump. And you've got your lines running out to the equipment, and that just will save your wrists so that you're not doing hand pruning. If you are hand pruning, there's a little trick. Uh, if you are cutting with a succator and it's just your own wrist strength that you're dealing with, if you push the branch away from you as you're cutting into the flesh, that really makes it a lot easier as opposed to just trying to leave the branch as it is. It's just that it sort of stretches the cells and then it allows the blade to just cut through and it slices really nicely. So you might want to try that if you're ever challenged with your wrist strength and you want to remove the branches. Push it away as you're cutting on the side that's closest to you. Maintenance phase, regular maintenance cuts. So just removing injured branches, disease branches, superfluous branches, all that kind of stuff. We've kind of talked about that. So some things that you might be looking for, here's like a type of canker. This is a fungal type of disease. There's blackleaf, different things like that. That if you see that, you can always remove disease material, and even if it's in the summertime, just cut slightly below where the disease is obvious, and then remove that stuff. Although in some cases, like with blackleaf, you may just prefer to use a fungicide or that sort of thing. With bacterial diseases, it's a little different. There are some products that you can use, and in some cases, it's like copper. And especially if you're in an orchard where there are bacterial diseases like fire blight or bacterial canker, then you might want to follow it up with a little spray of a copper product or that sort of thing. So you reduce the spread of the bacteria because bacteria grows sort of on a logarithmic scale. So it's not just like, oh, yeah, one spore or one particular bacteria landed here, and a week later there's going to be two. It's going to be 1,000 or more, or whatever. So it can spread quickly. So you want to control that as much as you can. So again, maintenance phase, fall dormant is a good time. Spring dormant is okay too. Growing season, do it with caution and make sure that you're not spreading the disease. Cut it out and burn what you're hauling away because you don't want it to be a little pocket of disease that's sitting there in your orchard and then gets spread around. So this is just a little photo. This was up in the northeast area of Saskatchewan, and these folks had been having trouble with um, fire blight on their Saskatoons. And so fire blight bacteria kind of spreads around. You'll usually have a little sunken zone on a stem somewhere, and particularly in spring, that'll start to ooze, and you'll see like some liquidy ooze that comes out. And I've seen it, like they say that it runs in a 7-year cycle.
And then I'll sit on the bounce, and then maybe I'll decide to short again.
I'm hearing somebody. That's okay. But things like pollinators even or flies that they'll sort of go down to lap up the little bit of liquid that they're finding along the branch, and then they fly to the flowers. Then the bacteria gets in the flower and it can go down through the vascular system and it eats out the plant. So there's different phases. That would be the early phase, and then there's a stem blight phase, and this would just be from like a previous year somebody pruned and then they didn't really get below where the fire blight was, and so it continued on. In this case, they were getting a fair spread, a pretty rapid spread of fire blight through their orchard, so I had recommended that they spray a product called Cassiman. Its active ingredient is called kasugamycin, and that is an antibiotic, but it's an antibiotic that only works on plants. And we sort of recommend that one over products like oxytetracycline because tetracyclines are used by humans, and we don't want, disease resistance to develop that would be infecting humans or whatever, right? So if we can use a product like kasugamycin that really is only affecting plants, then plant diseases, then we're not going to get that potential disease resistance that could come into our human um, you know, toolkit of things to control disease for us. Now, there's different ways of pruning, and of course, an easy way would be like a hedge trimmer. A lot of people think, okay, that's a great way. I'll just run down the aisle or the row and trim everything off, and that should work. But um, for some plants, that's okay, especially for getting the right shape. For example, in Haskap, you may want to do that. But you don't want to take something like this down and head your Saskatoon row, for example, because it doesn't do a good job of discriminating about what it's cutting. It just cuts whatever's in front of it. And so you'll result with something like this. So this person went down, they had the uh, cutter bar at about a 4 to 5 foot height. And they thought, well, if I cut it off, it's going to stimulate growth below, and then it'll be easier for people to pick it. This is a U pick. But what happened is they cut it off. As we mentioned before, the growth regulators, the auxins that are at the top, controlling what the plant perceives to be its you know, central leader is removed. And then you get a whole bunch of stimulation below. And so all the new growth is up top. It's still pretty tall. It's out of the reach of people, and all your production is up in that part of the canopy. So they would have been better off, if you're going to do it, to cut it lower. And I've seen that done effectively, but just in terms of like coppicing or whatever on bush fruit, generally not recommended. This would be a better sort of way of doing it. This is restructuring your plant, and you can cut it down to sort of like a structure like this. And I've seen this done in Saskatoons even. Surprisingly, it worked fairly well for this person. The new growth came up, and the buds that came off of here were relatively limber. They started producing fruit relatively quickly within a couple years, and that sort of thing. But with other plants, like if you're talking black currants and that sort of thing, you may, in those cases, have to constantly remove the older growth and just continue to stimulate that younger plant structure to produce fruit. Now, what we did with Saskatoon berries, and this started prior to my beginning with the Ministry of Agriculture here. This was my predecessor, Clarence Peters, started a small trial looking at what would happen, because Saskatoon berries are a crop that was natural to this environment. And we used to have prairie fires, grass fires that went through, and they'd burn everything that came across their path. And what would happen is you'd get, uh, orchard patches that would just rejuvenate themselves from the ground because they're on their own roots. And so the crowns don't get killed in a top growth fire. And then you've got the resources below that can send up new shoots. Now, if you don't do any burning, if you just remove the top and don't burn anything, it creates a crazy situation where you have all kinds of suckers with really uncontrolled growth. And you get this high density regrowth that's kind of unmanageable and quite difficult to run, for example, a mechanical harvester through, or to reach through, or that sort of thing. So again, like, these structures just get to be unreasonable. And the other thing is, you're not really controlling disease, versus if you burn it, you get less density. And so, if, for example, in this picture, you'll see that there's no growth, no suckers coming up below or off to the side. So you've narrowed your row width, and you've got new growth that's quite manageable. Like in this case, you've got a handful of new shoots that will be coming up, and they're supported by a mature root. So their ability to grow quickly is quite stunning. And within that first year, you'll see massive growth. And I'll touch on that because we continued to build on this after Clarence. I did a small adopt project, and that led into a larger strategic field project. And I'm just going to talk about that. Now, pruning with dwarf sour cherry is somewhat similar to Saskatoon's. So the plant is a medium shrub on its own roots, multi-stemmed in general. This is a Carmine Jewel, and with Carmine Jewel, that variety is a lot more branching. Like if you look at it, you're going to get all these cross branches. Some of the other varieties like Valentine or Cupid or you know, I'm forgetting the other names, Romeo. But anyway, those ones, they're not as sort of vigorously crossing. They have a little different structure and they're maybe a little bit more limber. Uh, and also the Evans cherry is also more of a larger plant than what the university varieties are. And it's maybe a little bit more rigid than the other sort of romance series of cherries that have that limber and maybe lend themselves a little bit more for mechanical harvesting if you were thinking about doing that with your cherries. So, um, in this case, fruit buds on your first year and old wood, so it's not just the new growth. There is some production off of the old spurs, so those run for like 2 or 3 years, depending upon the the health status of your plant. And the suckering is cultivar dependent, but that's something that if you're running mechanical harvesting, you're going to want to control the suckers because they're going to trip up your mechanical harvester and the trays won't close in on the canopy so that you get efficient fruit removal. Now, I'm just going to show some different things. I ran some different trials on cherries because we ran into a problem called blindwood, and I'll touch on that as well. Um, and again, if you look at the row, it's kind of a similar structure to what we want from a Saskatoon in a sense. And it's separated a little bit more, like whereas a Saskatoon would have a number of different plants in between the main plants, typically in a row. These ones retain that sort of individual plant structure unless you do some early training. And I'll kind of touch on that a little bit. So uh, with the sour cherries, there was some studies that were done early on, and they took the plants and they planted them at different depths. So and I would say if you're in a zone where you've got heavy clay, you're going to have to watch, especially if you did a fall planting and the plants are just sort of establishing themselves. So the roots are, barely really anchored in the soil or whatever. Over winter, on some clay soils will heave and they can push out your plant right out of the ground. And so you don't want that. It exposes the roots and it can desiccate them and cause all kinds of problems. So, if you did a fall planting and you're looking at what the depth is that you planted at, you may want to visit it in the spring. And if they're popping out, you better push them back down a little bit and cover them over so that they're not exposed and subject to desiccation on the roots. And so, yeah, uh, you want to plant them a little bit on the deeper side so that you prevent that from happening. And there was a little study that was done to see what the difference was if you did it like 5 to 7.5 centimeters deep, which we were calling deep planted, versus the ones where the crown is right basically at soil level. And what happens when you do that is the plant responds in different ways, and especially in that early phase, if you did a heading cut, then it stimulates growth in a deep plant to produce more shoots that are coming up from the ground. So this is a very shallow planted, and you can see most of the growth is coming from right at the crown, at the ground, and just developing up as a single plant. Um, Again, this is a little bit wider. It's growing out wide, and you may want to kind of cut out some of those so that the growth is a little bit more upright and less pushing out into the orchard row and that sort of thing. Here's a deep planted, and you can see there's a number of shoots coming out from the ground, and that over time will lend itself to that maintenance pruning where you're removing some of the older, more woody shoots or stems, and then you can select the ones that are still limber and still highly productive. And again, just showing this is Crimson Passion. Crimson Passion is one of those plants that tends to grow as a single plant. So in this case, if you planted it deep, and especially if you did a heading after the first year, then it'll stimulate side growth, and then you've got more to deal with as the plant matures. And again, here's like a shallow planted when it's cut, trying to do some rejuvenation. Most of the rejuvenation is all coming from this single stem. Deep planted, you're getting it from below ground, and there would be some more growth. It's not shown in this picture, but it grows further away from the plant typically. So those little early experiments, I would say, lended itself to a project, and in sour cherry, a lot of growers were running into a situation where they were getting a lot of blindwood. So blindwood is this condition where vegetative growth buds on cherry branches remain dormant or blind. So I'll show you a picture. It's the next one. How that presents itself is that along the branch, you'll have almost no leaves. Just at the distal end of the branch, you'll have this tuft of leaves that come out, and you can still get flowering. But the problem in a situation like this is, that conversion of solar radiation to fruit production isn't sufficient because there's only so many leaves. They're producing that, and it's going to get directed to maintaining the health of the plant, not necessarily producing fruit. And so what typically happens when the plants start to face this blindwood syndrome is that, your production goes down, the fruit quality goes down because there's just not enough energy to sustain it. So the question arises, well, what do you do to counteract that then? And there's different things that we've tried. One is the drastic method of cutting the plants to the ground and burning it and letting them regrow. Another one, there's plant growth regulators that you can spray that also influence, somewhat like when we've talked about heading. If you head a plant, then it sends a signal that there's no central leader anymore. With a plant growth regulator, it's sending a signal like, hey, these dormant buds where nothing is leafing out, you are stimulated to say, maybe we should start to leaf out. And so there's different products that we've tested for that to see if it in fact does that and what the success of that is. So I did that with a couple products, and I guess I kind of jumped over what those were. I used ProGib, which is a gibberellin. Gibberellin is a type of gibberellic acid, is a plant hormone. It's actually organic, so it comes from plants. There's nothing magic about it as far as where it came from. And we sprayed it at these rates, and they're marketed as products. This kind of knowledge came from the Ontario region and the Michigan area, where they do a lot of sour cherry production. And they found that if they use these gibberellic acids in different forms, ProGib, for example, is one, and Promelin is another one, which was supplied to me. Like I wanted to purchase this stuff. I told them what I was doing, and New Farm Canada donated it to the project. So I have to give kudos to them for supporting some of this work. But we sprayed that on there and then looked for what the results would be. And, the ratio of leaves to flower was poor in controlled crops. So, for example, you can see there's lots of flowers in this picture, but along the branches, there's not a lot of leaves. So that's a control. And in the control plots where there's blindwood symptomology, you might have a cluster of 5 flowers at the beginning. But because they don't have the energy to support the fruit production, over time, they're going to abort the majority of the fruit. So by the end of the season, from your potential of 5, in general, you're left with 1 at best, where you have heavy dwarf or heavy blindwood. Sorry. With the treated plots, on the other hand, with like the higher dosage of Promelin or ProGib, then we were seeing that you're getting more. And I mean, this is the first year after they were suffering from blindwood. So you can see in the picture here that there's a lot more leaves along the branch length and also more fruit. So the average turned out to be about 3 of 5 of potential cherries that were retained using that. Now, looking at different techniques for managing things and getting to sort of a little bit more of the removal or burning category of things where the plant is getting a little bit older and you just can't sustain it anymore than when we start moving into like Saskatoon berry rejuvenation techniques. And I did this on raspberry, Saskatoon berry, and dwarf sour cherry. And so this was my little adopt project. Unfortunately for me, I cut them down and in this case I used just like a brush mower. But that year I didn't have the ability to do the project as I had foreseen it. I was originally going to use flax straw and regular straw and at different depths and stuff like that. But it turned out we had a fire ban because it was a drought year and so I wasn't able to do that at all. So I had to switch gears and I thought, well, I can control it if I just use a propane torch. I'll cut these down and then I'll just propane torch them. But I wanted to use a different product as my other sort of treatment type. So I tested out a project called Apogee. Apogee is the active ingredient in that is prohexadione calcium. Prohexadione calcium is a gibberellin inhibitor. So it has lots of different effects. And one of the effects that it has with strawberries, for example, is it reduces runnering and everything. So my theory in that was that if I spray this on the Saskatoons, maybe it'll reduce suckering. And so it'll be somewhat similar to a burn treatment. So I sprayed them, but it was a poor idea. Upon reflection, I should have not done it in that spring. I should have sprayed the plants and then waited for the fall to do the cutting and then tried it out. Here's some examples of just the torch methodology. So you cut the plants down, torch them, and I mean, if you're doing this on a smaller scale, you can just get a 20-pound propane tank and get your torch. You can buy these at Princess Auto or wherever, and you just fire it up and run along and burn everything. It burns the weeds, it kills out the disease, and then reduces the number of suckers that are coming up. So it's mainly limited to the old crowns that are producing your new shoots and stuff that are coming from the ground. So this is just an example of just after I did the burn. This is what the ground looks like after you've done it. And here's what my plot arrangement was. It's not really that exciting. In the Saskatoons, I did, I think it was about 20 meters or something like that of Thiessen, and then another one in Smoky. And then in terms of the sour cherries, I did it in different varieties of sour cherries and then just looked at them over time. Average growth length, height after the cut and burn after the first year was pretty profound. Like, you get about 1.3 meters of new growth. I was getting in that scenario, and just in some cases, slightly under a meter to a little bit over a meter of regrowth in the sour cherries. So this is a little plot of Saskatoon berries. This is cut, no burn treatment here. So you're getting it's pretty wide, row, and there's quite a few stems that are coming up there. But again, it's pretty healthy growth. And in that year, you won't get any production. Okay, but in the following year, you get a rebound and it kind of is like a mature plant because you've got mature roots below the ground. And here's your Valentine. This is the new growth that's coming up. This is June 24th, so just early days for its reestablishment. So this is a photo of the Valentine sour cherries that were grown at CSIDC. And as you can see, the regrowth was averaged out at about 109 centimeters per plant. This particular picture shows one that was slightly taller at closer to 117 centimeters, but the average was at roughly 109. So that's what could be expected. This was at a small orchard research plot, but similar things can be seen in a field, and this is from a commercial grower near Imperial, Saskatchewan, and they had cut their Valentine cherries down to the ground, and this is a picture of myself out measuring, and the average for this particular row was 1.3 meters of regrowth for that type of sour cherry. So, you know, it is fairly effective regrowth, and if you think about it, they have mature rootstock, so the roots are supporting the sort of rapid regrowth of those plants. So in conclusion, Saskatoon responses were uniform, but could have benefited from a longer and hotter burn. Apogee and controlled treatments did not work as well as hoped with too much uncontrolled growth. And part of that was that I applied the apogee late in the fall. It should have been applied in the spring to affect the plants over the growing season so that they weren't suffering as much naturally. But with a late application, the apogee didn't have a chance to have its effect. In cherry, response was similar to Saskatoon, but less vigorous, slightly more subdued. And that was consistent not only at this site, but at other commercial growers. We've seen a similar sort of thing. And in 2020, the Saskatoon berries produced fruit, but cherries did not. In general, 2019 and 2020 were poor years for cherry production, mainly due to blindwood. And there was some fire blight in the Saskatoon berries in the control plots, but the treated plots that were right adjacent to those, there was very little fire blight disease spread or progression in those. And that continued for several years afterwards where they didn't have infections. So it was pretty good result as far as that goes. Now, as far as pruning raspberries, I should go backwards a little bit and just talk about raspberry biology a little bit. So raspberries grow for a fair amount of time. Like you could expect them to grow for 15 years without dieback. Mainly it's limited by viral infections, but there are some other diseases that can have an impact as well. The crown is long-lived, so you know, so long as you have a healthy crown and roots, then it should rejuvenate. Even if you get fire blight, for example, they will come back. New shoots come from the crown buds or currants. And so you typically talk about floricanes and primocanes, and there are sort of like two different types. There are some raspberry plants that are just primocane growing habit versus floricanes, which floricanes produce these canes that come up in the first year, and they set flowers, and then the next season they produce fruit. The primocanes that come up in the first year, they don't produce fruit. It's a 2-year cycle for production that way. And so, as I say, floricanes are the traditional type. They fruit in 2 years. Year 1 is a vegetative cane, also referred to as a primocane. Year 2 is fruit on laterals. It requires annual pruning. Pruning is labor intensive and requires a medium growing season at least. And trellising it can be optional. And it does kind of, under the right conditions, lend itself to insect and mite pest problems. And with overgrowth, it also can start to become problematic with disease. Primocanes, as I say, they fruit in 1 year. Year 1, the vegetative cane grows up, but it also sets fruit in that year. And it fruits in fall on the shoot tips. Year 2, it fruits in the summer on that same thing usually, and fall. So I'm going to talk about different varieties and some that were very successful and that would be my recommended varieties to grow. That it's less labor intensive, requires longer growing seasons, and in general, primocane raspberries are not well suited for Saskatchewan growing conditions. in Alberta, you'd probably be similar, although maybe in southwestern Alberta, you might be able to get away with some of the primocane varieties. Requires trellising or not, and insect pests are generally avoided or less problematic. So in floricane types, we have an annual renewal system. It means you prune immediately after harvest. So you've collected all the fruit off the floricanes, and then you remove those floricanes or all the fruited canes. And you remove sort of spindly canes or unhealthy ones, and try to prevent as much insect and disease infestations as you can. And then in the fall, generally, I would try to narrow the rows if they're becoming overgrown, as it's seen in this picture. And part of the reason for that is if you don't have a very open canopy, then you get more moisture that stays in the canopy. You'll get insects that then have a nice habitat, and also diseases that like the moisture and then spread to the canes and spread rapidly from cane to cane and cause problems. So try to keep those clean and nicely separated so you can see how that's meant to be done there. And there's another alternative, which is the alternate row system, which, basically you allow the one row to remain growing and producing fruit, but the other one you cut down to the ground and let it regrow. And then, you'd have to have multiple rows to keep it so that you have production available for you pick operators or for your contracted production. So if you're selling to a winery or whatever, at least you have something to sell. And you reverse that as time goes on. But that would use a lot of space. So I looked at some other alternatives, and I used a brush cut mower, and we tried to cut through the raspberry plots that are at the Canada Saskatchewan Irrigation Diversification Center. And these are just some pictures of how that brush cut mower did the job. And you can see that it's pretty rough. Like you would think that this would have a very damaging effect on plant regrowth. But as it turned out, they all came back nicely. And so this was my plot design in the research area there. And this is spring of 2019, I believe, was the year that fall we had cut these down. And so spring, you can see there's basically no regrowth initially, but by the middle of June, there was some. And here's a picture taken June the 24th. You can see the rows that weren't cut are fairly large and will set themselves up for production, whereas these two rows were cut to the ground and they're just struggling to regrow to the size of the ones that weren't cut. But even in this picture, you can see that some of these plants are basically the same as what the primocanes are on these other rows that weren't cut. So it's healthy regrowth. It's coming from the roots or the crowns, and there's no problem with it. This is a little later in summer, and you can see they're starting to catch up with this. You've got fruit production on these ones. Most of these plots won't have any fruit production on them, although this particular variety is prelude, and you can see that there are some flowers developing on that one, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So in terms of growth measurements, in red bounty and red mammoth that are typically grown, at least in Saskatchewan, a lot of people have these varieties. Pretty decent regrowth. Prelude, which is a taller plant, it grew to full height as well as Nova. And those ones, these were the uncut, these are the mowed ones. You can see that there was a little bit of discrepancy in heights and stuff, but not that significant by the end, just a slight average lower. And in terms of production, you get a loss because you've cut them to the ground, and most of these varieties are not going to return to production. So you can see with the ones that were uncut that are above this faint line here, this is the yield that we got from them in that particular year. But with Prelude, we actually did get, because it's it produces on its primocane. So in the fall, we got, a decent amount of production coming off of those. So it's not a total loss that year. And these are just some pictures showing the progress and how the plants regrew. By the end of the summer, they were basically on par with the others. And again, this prelude variety with production coming from those primocanes. And then the next year, they produced heavily on the floricanes that had set up flowering in this particular year. And you'll also get more production from the primocanes, like the standard ones. So in conclusion, in raspberry, all varieties are capable of being mowed, but no production can be expected from standard cultivars in the same year. All raspberries reestablished and were roughly as tall as uncut rows by the end of production season. The raspberry cultivar Prelude shone in this demonstration, and it did produce fruit in the first year after mowing, making it a more highly promising candidate for employing this reduced labor raspberry patch management technique. Prelude can produce a lot more fruit in late fall if conditions are favorable. So sometimes you'll get, a decent fall that runs well into October. If you have production like this, let's say it's flowered and you've got these fruit that aren't ripe yet going into October, and if you got a deep frost in early October, then it would probably shut down looking like this. But if October remains relatively warm, you'll get a decent fruit set from these, which is unlike most of the other varieties. I haven't come across another variety that's as good at production in late fall for this. So that's why it's basically very highly recommended. Now, we also did a Haskap agronomy and variety trial. It's funded under a strategic field project funding submission, and it was done at the Conservation Learning Center, just 22 kilometers south of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. This is a picture of the setup. There are 1,280 plants pictured here, 20 different varieties, and it's set up to have a lot of different agronomic factors. So some of them are different kinds of mulch, different amounts of irrigation, and different amounts of fertilizer that are produced. This is the sort of fertilizer injection system. There's a water line that comes in here. It runs through here, and the sort of Venturi effect sucks some of the fertilizer into the line, and this can be modified to regulate the amount that you put into the irrigation line, and then it just flows down. Each of these rows has a shut-off valve at the front, so I could regulate how much fertilizer each row gets via that methodology. So you can see here just the different things that were tested. So black plastic mulch, white plastic mulch, red wood mulch, landscape fabric, and then a control that didn't have any mulch. And then with fertilizers, we just used sort of a standard amount was for all the other test plots. But in this particular one, we added in 2 times the granular fertilizer, 3 times the granular fertilizer, 4 times the fertigation, 6 times, and all the rest of that. And then we did one that was based on, in terms of irrigation, on tensiometer. And we also did some that were 2 drip lines at different times per week. And so some were getting more water than others, some were getting more fertilizer. And here's a picture showing the double line of irrigation water. And that was done because Haskap is sort of relatively shallow rooted. And so I wanted to see that if we just sort of widened out the drip line, if it would help with vigor of the young growing plant. And although there was some vigor shown in those ones, it didn't add up to a significant difference in the long run in terms of yield or anything else. So it's not necessary. So year 2 yields, and this is very early production, but the university varieties, the Boreal series, were up on top in that case, and Kauai was pretty decent in the early stages. But this is just in the second year of growth, and so it isn't indicative of overall long-term production. Although the boreals did maintain their superiority over time. So here, two conclusions. Overall, the treatment required the most weeding, had the poorest vigor, shortest plants, and lowest yields. Black plastic and landscape fabric were the most vigorous plants with good yield. And the higher rate fertigation treatments resulted in vigorous plants, but the benefit didn't translate into high yield, so not necessary. Trends in vigor and yield in the irrigation block were difficult to discern, uh, perhaps due to good levels of precipitation in the 2020 growing season. So earlier on, it was kind of tough to tweak out what was good and what wasn't. But as time progressed, this was a 4-year project. Landscape fabric would seem to be superior over all the other varieties. And, you know, it has been suggested that you could add like landscape fabric and then add a mulch over top, would just give you that little bit extra. And then in terms of total yield in year 4, you can see again, Boreal Blizzard, Boreal Beast, all these ones are the highest yielding, good quality. And Aurora, that is the commercial sort of standard, was you know, pretty decent production. It's relatively consistent, so remains as a recommended variety for commercial production. When we look at these plants, there's different growth habits. And so this is a little bit hard to discern what's going on in this chart, but if you look at the plants that are classified as being bushy, that means they stay close, growing close to the ground. They don't have a vertical architecture versus the varieties that have more vertical production, these orange ones that are more 100% of the plant is basically growing in a vertical direction. Those are superior for commercial production if you're looking at mechanical harvesting, and even in terms of practicality of having a UPEC operation, because the ones that are on the ground and growing horizontally, it's hard for people to see the fruit. It's hard for them to bend over and lift up to pick and that sort of thing. So again, sort of recommending these ones that are more upright, and Aurora, for example, fits in that. So do the Boreal varieties. So those ones retain that. Just looking at some different harvesting equipment and the way that it's done. So with Haskap, we were using the Tijuana Premium at the university, and you know, it comes as a side swipe kind of thing. It pulls the plant over a little bit and shakes, and then the fruit falls off. This is just a smaller scale one that you pull yourself physically, and then you shake the plants and it falls into these catchment frames, and then those can be lifted and the fruit would roll into those trays and then can be taken out of the field. So just different pictures showing how that works. But as you can see with this one, these plants weren't pruned for this kind of operation. So it looks like there's a fair amount of damage here. And it lends itself to the idea that maybe we need to prune these properly for mechanical harvesting. So that led into a different project. This is, I have a colleague, Artem Sorokin, he's from the Vavilov Institute in Russia, and they recently made this video showing Haskap production that they have in Russia. And so I took a capture from his video and just showed how they're pruned there. Like you can see, it's very vertical, upright, and they use an over-the-row harvester to harvest those. This, I'm getting a whistle. Is there a problem? Anyway,
No,
I'll keep
I
on.
don't hear anything on this side.
Okay, I'll keep on going. This is in northwestern Saskatchewan, and again, he's kind of pruned them so that they're a little bit more of a V shape, better for mechanical harvesting. And this is Aurora variety mainly, but you can still see a fair amount of damage coming through, which is going to affect your next year's productivity and everything, right? So you can have fairly dense plantings in Haskap. So, you know, you could talk 3,000 plants per hectare or more. Here's an aerial shot of a vertical berry harvester running through their orchard. And again, here's a plant going through that, and you can see like here's the tines that are shaking it, but even the lower part of the plant here is not really being shaken properly to get all the berries out. But it's doing a pretty good job. So that pruning technique is pretty well suited for that. This is the Tamichka variety, which was the progenitor of our berry blue variety. And then that led us out of the agronomy project. We wanted to do a pruning Haskap pruning thing. So we just used the same randomization of plants. So that's the randomization in color, but we did different pruning cuts. And so there's 5 different styles of cuts, and they're randomized like this. So we've got different ones. We were calling number 1 was control, old wood selective, upright closed, upright open canopy. And this is sort of what they look like. The idea with the Y split is that, for the side harvester, that these would come down, you come down the other way, and it would just pull the branches in, and it would be pretty good. Upright closed, it's less work to get it into this structure and a fairly productive space. Old wood selective, you're just cutting out the old wood, not really concerned about the structure so much, but you are removing that lower portion. And then upright open and looking at what the different characteristics are. So this is just, we put a net over showing that. One little side topic, these are tarnished plant bugs, and you can see some of the damage that they do, not only on the leaves, but on the fruit. And the problem with these things, they can damage the flowers, so you're going to get less production because of the flower damage to begin with. But then on the fruit, they also feed on this, and when they do that, they release some enzymes into the fruit, and the enzymes sort of linger and create an off flavor. So if you have those lygus bugs, you want to control those in your Haskap. You might think that they're not really doing that much, but when it comes to the end of the season and you're tasting, you might get a few off flavors, and that's probably from the lygus bug damage. And also it could have some other structural damage that you'll see on the berries, so you want to avoid that as much as possible. So we looked at this and looked at, we were able to count the number of flowers and then look at the number of berries that were produced based on the type of pruning that was done, and then what the difference was, and then got a proportion. There wasn't that much of a difference, but still pretty good fruit set. So 75%, 74% is pretty on target for what you want to maximize production in any commercial orchard. And then we looked at the average time to prune. So, boreal blizzard as an upright one, it had more growth that needed to be removed because it was a larger plant. So some of these things are kind of like not really indicative of the quality of the plant when it comes to pruning. It's not a fair treatment of each plant type, I would say. But then yield, there was some yield difference. This is not showing the different categories, but and different varieties. Again, not really representative in this particular case. BioBest is bumblebees, and if you're growing Haskap, you probably want to have bumblebees in your orchard, whether they're natural or not. It helps because they'll fly when temperatures are cool. If it's above 10 degrees, then your honeybees will come in. But if it's below 10 degrees, honeybees won't fly in those cooler conditions. The bumblebees will be in there. Haskap flowers when it's cool. So make sure you're doing everything to support bumblebee populations in your orchards. So the upright closed and the split canopy turned out to be our better average time to prune one plant as time went on. And then average yield per plant, again, upright closed was the best. So, if you want to pick a structure, it's probably best that one. And then there was a difference in the berry size too, with upright closed having pretty good size. The upright open canopy was a larger size berry, but the yield overall was a little bit lower. So it's a kind of trade-off. You might get better quality, but less. So the upright closed is probably the recommended type of cutting. This is a picture of a sycamore that some of the commercial growers have started to employ this type of system. And so this allows them to do a lot of pruning relatively quickly. And so in this case, for example, it's mounted on the front of a small tractor. And this sycamore can be adjusted so that you could have an angle like so that you produce a V-shaped plant. Now, it doesn't discriminate, based on what the particular branch is. It would just go down the row and give you that shape, but it's efficient and it lends itself well to large scale operations that don't have time to do selective pruning or anything like that. And some of the modifications that people have done, in this particular case, this would be flipped so that it's shaped down, but they've added in little brackets so that the lower lying branches can be lifted up slightly, and it tends to sort of direct it into the sycamore so those get cut off. Because otherwise, as you were driving down the row, some of the lower branches were being missed and it creates a problem and then they have to go back. So yeah, there's some modifications that could be done this way. But anyway, these sycamores are quite efficient. There's other types, and this is one that the University of Saskatchewan owns. It's more expensive, so I'm not sure I would recommend that, but depending upon the scale of your operation, it's something that you could look at. Now, we had another project, which is another strategic field program supported, research initiative, and that is evaluation, cutting, and burning protocols for rejuvenation of overgrown Saskatoon berry orchards. And this study assessed the effect of cutting height, cutting method, burning on the rate of plant regrowth, productivity, and plant health. The number of stems, plant health height over time, average yield, and plant health were measured over several years, so 4-year period. I should mention that this was contracted out, so we had a couple different cooperators. One was Prairie Berries Inc. Near Keeler, Saskatchewan. The other one was Riverbend Plantation, which is just along the South Saskatchewan River south of Saskatoon and is owned by the Whittington. So we did 2 of those, and then their crew took data for us, and then Rob Spencer was contracted to analyze the data and write the report for this project. So Spencer Horticultural Contracting was hired to do this project. So they were comparing flail mowing at Riverbend versus this cutting machine that had the ability to cut at different heights at Prairie Berries Farm. And they spent money to buy that equipment. So I'll just show you some of those. And then each of the farms were compared with no burning, regular flax straw, as well as using a propane torch technique that I had sort of looked at earlier in an Adopt project. This is a picture of the Flegel orchard cutter. And so this is imported from Germany, and it has these large blades that go down the row, and they just cut all of the top growth off. And you can adjust it height-wise, so this would mount on a tractor, and you can lift and lower it. And this also is on hydraulics, so it can be lowered down. You can drive down the side of the row, and then it does its cutting job. And so you can see that it's fairly efficient at doing that. And then the flail mower is just like that Bobcat brush cut mower. This is just another picture of the Flegel and how it could be set up on a tractor and go down the road that way. And you can see how the blade cut through the trees. This is very superior to trying to do it with a chainsaw. It's too much work, and you can see this person's bent over. It's not comfortable. It's kind of a pain. You've got to have eye protection because you can get whiplash that hurts your eyes and everything else. It's not recommended. So this is sort of a half of the plot of Prairie Berries test plot. They also had some others. This is a small orchard that's near their processing facility. They have another orchard that's 160 acres further down the road, and they did some test plots there as well. but this is about half of the test plot that's near their processing facility. And this is just an example of a control. So this is where it was cut, not burnt, and you get this pretty dense regrowth, which isn't really desired. This is regrowth, a picture of regrowth in 2022. I just wanted to point out that they do narrow the rows at Prairie Berries. So they use diskers and they run down the side. They've cut out one set of diskers, and then it gives the width that they want for mechanical harvesting. So it just tightens the rows up. So yeah, in spring removal, there was little difference in row height between burnt and unburnt orchard rows, and they all approximately were 42 to 43 centimeters of regrowth. I'll just go through this because I've got some other slides that show the regrowth. So I'll just show you the pictures in this case. This row was not within the test block, so this is part of their other orchard, but it's a first year post cutting, and the photo was taken in August. And those are, well over half a meter tall for sure. This one, there's no irrigation in this orchard, so this is just growing, and again, it was under drought conditions, so that may have impacted how strong the regrowth was. Again, you're dealing with a mature root system, so it's able to obtain resources through its wide structure. Nevertheless, it probably limited growth somewhat. And this is a picture. This is Melvin Sakara. He's one of the orchard managers at Prairie Berries, and this is kind of a picture showing how they did the measurements. So they selected certain spots that were randomized, and they did 1 meter plots, and then did count and measurements based on those 1 meter areas that are in the randomization. And they got these sort of results. So if you look at it, the torch burn was actually really good as far as having regrowth. So it did the job in terms of preventing massive sucker re-establishment, and had superior amounts of regrowth height. And these are just other pictures in their orchard that's near the processing facility. And I think this is in year 2, just showing that they continue to grow. And generally in year 2, you get some production. We also have some data from the Riverview Riverside plantation. So they have this as some of the cut in year 2 that are regrowing, and again showing a similar thing. And this is with the flail mower as opposed to the saw. And you can see again, this is with the torch, and it's doing very well. But there's some, flax did very well as well. And so it just takes a little bit longer for the flax burn to come back, and it did well. So, there's different ways. If you have like access to some some propane torches, and that fits onto your tractor so that you can draw it behind and get a good burn behind, then maybe that's the option for you. But if not, then flax straw is probably a good option as well. It's a slow burning type of biomass, and it does the job and prevents massive flush of suckers from coming back. It just controls the growth. Now, so you can see that, and I'll just run through this post-cutting burn treatments, and again, showing width. And so this is controlling, outside of the fact that Prairie Berries did narrow the rows with their disker, the burn treatment does a narrowing effect too, because it kills the suckers, like the sucker growth and rhizomes underground to a certain extent with a good burn. Versus, earlier on, I did a small trial with this, with just a handheld propane torch, and I didn't give it enough burn. I was too fast in traveling over the cut area, and I didn't widen my space out for my burn, and that way those sections of the plant underground weren't impacted and regrew. So Doing the torch burn, you have to make sure that you've got the width that you need and going slow enough that you do a good sufficient burn. And it'll control the width because then you get mainly regrowth from the mother plant's crown area. And so, yeah, just different pictures showing the number of stems per meter of row. And, you know, as you can see with this one, regular straw didn't do a very good job. You've got a lot of stems per meter. With nothing, again, a lot of stems per meter. But with the torch, it's doing a pretty good job. And at Riverbend, for example, with the torch in spring cut, it did a very effective job. But as time goes on, some suckers will come up to widen the row. And that's where you could employ the diskers or whatever else to keep the row under control. Now, average berry yield. So, of course, in the first year after cutting, you're not going to get anything because the plant is just regrowing. So it's got vegetative growth. It hasn't set up flowers to produce berries. But in the second year, you do get production. And so, for example, at Prairie Berries, they've got 2,000 grams per meter of row. And same thing with the torched version versus the flax burning. So, and this is just a picture of their 160-acre orchard, sort of towards one corner, and it just shows how they kind of manage the orchard rows and keep them relatively, not tall. They're sort of medium height, and then when they get a little bit too high for the mechanical harvester, they'll take a section and they'll just cut it out and do the burn job, and they they kind of self-regulate themselves that way. This is another area where some clients did their own cut program. They didn't really burn. I guess they didn't get that portion of the memo that they should have burnt the row here. And one of the problems that they also faced was that there was heavy weed infestation. So, that's another aspect of things, is to make sure that you have good weed control going in and try to maintain that. Otherwise, it gets a little bit messy. And this is just a few other pictures. This is showing one of the orchards that had a heavy infestation of hawthorn lacebug. And, we don't have economic models to say when you should spray for these, but with an older, mature orchard that's kind of overgrown, you'll see a lot of these, and sometimes they go unmanaged, and it weakens the plant. And in my opinion, you get a yield reduction over time if it's not managed. Now, I sort of had promised to touch on black currants, so I'll just do a quick cover of that crop. It's naturally low-headed, multi-stem shrub with very little suckering. And, so you'll get a crown and it's got multiple stems that come up. And how do you prune that? How do you control its growth so that you get sustained, decent yields from it? They tend to produce fruit on their 1-year-old wood and on lateral branches. And so 1 year and 2nd-year-old wood, and then generally it production greatly diminishes by the time you're into year 3 for those particular stems. So how do you manage that? Here's one that's in pretty good production levels, but at establishment, you want to plant it deep and head so that you get sort of multi-stems coming from the basal area or the crown area. And then you can select different shoots as time goes on from that established form. So you can see here's in a 2nd year, a little bit better production. And this will close in over time. So by year 3 or 4, you'll be dealing with a solid row. But you just go through a process of removing weaker shoots and constantly select some. So in general, if you start off, if I'm in theory having a pack of 6 stems that come up, you would select your 6 best new shoots and then selectively take out the remaining sort of dormant or overgrown shoots that are not productive anymore. Again, I typically do this type of thing during the dormant period. So wait until the plants are not growing. Although if there's generally you don't see too much disease in black currant, so it's not the case of cutting out, but it won't have that significant a dwarfing effect, unlike some other plants if you do summer removal or whatever. But it's better to do it in the dormant period. Remove 6 3-year-old shoots and retain 6 2-year-old shoots. And then also select 6 of best of the new replacement shoots and remove the weakest ones in the patch kind of thing in each plant. And then what you can do is just continue that selection process using that 6-6-6 type of selection. So removing 6 of the oldest, retaining 6 of the mid growth ones, and then selecting 6 of the best new ones and removing like all of the rest. So that keeps it clean, keeps the canopy open, and sustains yield over time. And that's it.
Sounds good. So, yeah, Dawn and Rebecca, I think, are going to go through some of the questions.
Okay.
So you can fire away.
Okay. So first question, we've had a few people asking, is the presentation going to be available to people so they can see the slides that are missed?
And
Yeah.
yes, as well. Yeah.
All right. Moving on. So for you pick growers, what height would you prune your Saskatoons to, and also Haskaps?
Well, Haskap's for you pick. Like I would say that number one, select the varieties that are going to be more suitable for ease of harvest. So those low-lying ones, I would discourage you from growing those. Like even though Indigo Gem and some of those other ones are, decent quality fruit, it's hard to get them. You have to bend over and pull the branches up, and versus something like Boreal Beast or some of those more vertical ones, people can stand up and pick and move along easily, and you can prune it so that it's that sort of more upright V shape, so that it's easy for them to reach in and grab things. So yeah, I would recommend the boreal varieties over mixed in with just some others. And again, I can send the selection to them via email if they're interested in the full spectrum. Like Aurora is a good one to have in your mix for sure. And you can do that like, even one row of Aurora and then a couple boreal, um, boreal blizzard, whatever mixed.
Okay, next question. When burning, what types of fire prevention techniques are used to ensure controlled burn?
Well, I didn't get into that, but it turned out that we tested flax straw was one of the top ones. It's a slower burn, but it's a more thorough burn. So we generally would recommend flax straw if you're going with straw. But it turned out that the torch burn, like the propane torch, you can mount them in front of a tractor or whatever. And what Prairie Berries was doing is they actually had the front cutters that were taking out the plant material, and they had staff to pull stuff away, or it would just go to the side. And then behind, mounted at the back, was a burner that had 2 nozzles that were facing down on the cut portion, and they just burnt it as they went along. And that was actually the most efficient system for burning, and that was easier to control too, in my opinion anyway. Like the flax straw tends to burn for a long time. The propane, as soon as you finish going over it, it's basically done. So, you can have somebody following behind with a water can or whatever. And if there's something that gets out of control, you can spray it down. But in general, the propane one is easy to deal with. versus straw, for example, if you got winds or whatever that come up, then it'll blow the flames and it could catch. So yeah, more highly recommend the propane option.
Okay, next question. I have a large, very established Haskap, 10 years plus, that has not had a large prune. Would I prune it the same manner you described for the rejuvenation phase? And
I
can sorry, I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, we haven't tested that out in Haskap yet. Uh, it's been suggested by some people that you could do that, but we haven't done it. So that's the one where I don't know. Our pruning so far has been on plants that were 4 years old, and then we started pruning them to try to create a shape that was suitable for mechanical harvesting. But we haven't reached that, you know, and I would say 10 years is still a relatively young plant in terms of Haskap. So in the case of a 10-year orchard, you may want to just go in and selectively prune out the older wood. But yeah, I wouldn't try the rejuvenation yet. And maybe let us do some experimentation on the whole cutting and burning thing. I would suspect with Haskap, you don't need to do the burn. You might just want to do a cut and let it rejuvenate that way.
So another part to that question was, can I reduce the entire plant back to a few main stems?
Yeah, and I would suspect you can, but again, that would be a test. It's not, there's nothing. And the thing about Haskap is there are very few diseases, so you don't have things like fire blight or whatever else that you need to worry about. So the burn, and it doesn't sucker profusely, so the burn component of it isn't as necessary as with things like Saskatoons and sour cherries that sucker fairly profusely. So the burn does a job to get rid of the disease, and it reduces suckering. And in general, then they're trimming it up. Like in the case of prairie berries, they went through with a disker and trimmed the spread even after doing the cut and burn, just to make sure that the rows were narrow. But in Haskap, you don't have to worry about that as much. So I think you would skip the burn portion of it.
All right. Next question. Have raspberries that grew 9 feet tall. When should we prune and how much can we cut off?
Okay, I suspect that might be like the Viking variety. And those ones I would say, like, you might just do, if you want to do a total revamp, you can cut them down, like wait till the fall or even in spring and cut them down to the ground. And I didn't show that, but I just went with like this one was in front of a cat machine, but you could do a toe behind flail mower, and it looks like it's fairly brutal, but they all grow back. At least the varieties that I tested were quite responsive in growing. You don't get anything from them in the year that you cut them. Like if you did it in the spring or whatever, or if you did it in the fall and you're waiting that next year, you're not going to get production from those Viking cultivars or those other ones that are tall like that. Or you're unlikely to. But you will in the second year, you'll get the floricanes coming and producing. So, you know, you're forgoing that 1 year of production in those cultivars, but you get a new row and you can trim it up and make it more manageable if you're running into trouble with it being overgrown. Prelude is really good that way because you get fruit in the year that you cut it, or if it was in the fall, then you'd get it the next fall.
Okay.
But I
Next
haven't
question.
tried.
Sorry. Sorry,
I
I didn't
haven't
interrupt you
I
there.
haven't tested that particular variety, and I'm not even sure which variety that is, so that he's talking about or they're talking about.
Yeah, there was no mention of a variety in that one, so.
Yeah.
Okay. When you spoke about controlling the spread of fungus like fire blight, you mentioned using a product to kill the spores. I've always used alcohol to disinfect tools. Is that not enough when dealing with a potential fungal disease?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the sort of standard thing. You've got different things that you can add in there as a sterilant in between cuts. But sometimes, you can do all the sterilization you want on your tools and everything, but there's still bacteria growing in your orchard. And all it takes is a plant or an insect or even wind or precipitation to, hit the right um, bacteria on a anywhere that's infected, and it'll transfer over, and then it's got an open wound that it can go into. So what I say about that is, yes, continue to do that with your pruning shears and stuff, but also consider spraying after you've done your pruning operation with, a copper product, for example. And there's some others like even uh, kasugamycin. It's a little harder to get a hold of. Like you have to order that in, and you'd probably have to go through a specialized retailer to get it. But um, those really help. And as I sort of mentioned a little bit, but fire blight kind of goes on a 7-year cycle in theory. It's not always perfectly 7 years, but sometimes it's a lot more infectious than other years. And so you kind of have to watch out. You might be able to get away with, okay, I'm just doing my, succateur sterilization in between for a number of years. But every once in a while, uh, the bacteria is going to be more virulent and it's going to spread a lot more. And in that condition, your sterilization probably isn't going to be sufficient just on your tools alone.
Okay. Another question actually just popped into the chat there. If fire blight is in the ecosystem, is it always there and are you just controlling it, or is it possible to eradicate it?
Well, and that's where the burn methodology sort of started in a sense, is like people did have widespread fire blight and it can wipe out your whole orchard relatively quickly. So the strategy there is cut it all off, burn the whole thing, and then you've eliminated it. Unless you've got fire blight in some adjacent, wild things. But like I had a situation in Outlook where I only had a small plot that I cut to the ground and I did that burn mechanism on. The other plants that were surrounding it were mature plants and they did have fire blight on them. So my control plot in my cut where I didn't do a burn, those plants did get some fire blight on them, just the stem blight portion. But the other stuff that I burnt, it didn't come back with any fire blight. So, it is like there's different methodologies of controlling, and I mentioned that Apogee product. It's really registered for apples. We're trying to get it into Saskatoons as well, but they use Apogee as a method to suppress um, fire blight. And what it does is physiologically limit the amount of growth. And they found that if you get a rapidly growing, or if you've got a high fertilization rate and your trees are growing rapidly, they're more susceptible to fire blight. Versus if you spray them with Apogee, it limits the growth and it also stimulates immune factors. So in that case, then it greatly reduces the spread of fire blight and helps control it. So yeah, there's different techniques for control, but definitely the cut and burn technique helps to control. And the other thing with fire blight is it needs blossoms. So when you do that intervention where for 1 year you're not getting any blossoms, that eliminates the disease cycle. So it's harder for it to get back in, or it takes a long time for it to reestablish. I hope that makes sense. I kind of jump around all over the place.
I think it made sense.
Okay.
A next question. When pruning Haskaps, should you be opening up the bush?
I I do like to have an open canopy, but you don't want to do so much that the more that you do in terms of pruning, you can have an impact on your yield. So if you do a heavy pruning, like more than a quarter of the old branches coming out, which, if you haven't done any pruning and you're saying, okay, I'm going to clean this thing up and I'm going to remove a lot of old wood, you're going to impact your yield. So I would just limit the amount, but take out a lot of the nasty old wood and then slowly build into it. That takes more time though. If you're on a large scale, a lot of guys are just taking like one of those trimmers. They put it in an angle, they form the V shape, and they might do a little bit of selective pruning, but that's it's fairly limited.
Okay. So when pruning Haskaps and Saskatoons in the spring, how do you determine what is the old branches? For example,
Well,
when there are no buds present.
yeah, well, you should be able to tell from the bark. Like it usually tends to start to get a little ratty looking, worn, a little darker, thicker. Um, that's the older wood. And if you follow it up quite often, you'll see it would probably be a little bit more centralized and uh, typically more internal. And as you go up, there's not very much of the new growth. And usually in most plants, you can see where the new growth started from the last year. If you take the end of the stem and you go back, you'll come to a little knob, and there's a difference usually in the bark color. So it's a lighter color, or in some cases, it might be like a more red color or something like that. So usually you can tell if you just look carefully at it.
Okay, so couple of questions about rejuvenating a mature Saskatoon orchard.
Mhm.
First one, what equipment do you use to renovate a mature Saskatoon orchard?
Okay. Uh, there's different techniques for doing this, and like I did show a chainsaw, and some people that if you're not on a large scale, you could just use a chainsaw, or even those pneumatic pruners or whatever. You can just go down and cut out all of the branches and remove that stuff. You burn it somewhere else, and then if you have access to flax straw or something, you can go like that. Or I showed that one picture where they just have a cart and a little 20-pound propane tank. You get a flame burner and you light it up and you just burn it. So it doesn't take the massive equipment that some of the people have. I tried doing it with one of it's sort of like a Farm King of 5 rough cut mower, a 5 foot wide rough cut mower on some of the more established Saskatoons at the Canada Saskatchewan Irrigation Diversification Center in Outlook. Those, it wasn't very successful. It was really damaging the plants. So I think you want something that's a little sharper, a little cleaner cut than like just a toe behind, uh, rough cut mower, for example. But there are mowers that are out there that you can buy that mount on a tractor or on a cat machine, and they're hydraulic run or whatever, or you can get some that are run by a PTO, and they do a cleaner cut, and you can just run through and cut them. Or there may be, I don't know this for the Edmonton area, but there may be some people that you could contract to do that for you. Like there's some equipment that you might not want to purchase yourself, but you could just get someone to come in and do the cut for you.
So it's the same person, just kind of for a clarification.
Yeah.
In an older, mature Saskatoon orchard, if I understand renovation correctly, you cut the bushes, leave them in place, apply flax straw on top, and then burn with a propane torch on top of the flax and the cut bushes?
Just one thing about that is when you cut the top growth off, generally we remove that. We don't leave it in place generally it's hauled off and then burnt somewhere else. It's just the practicality of if you're laying the flax straw down, you want it to cover over the old plant material that's there. You don't want it, and I guess I mean, it's up to you. You could leave that in, but I think it's going to be a bigger mess if you try it that way. We didn't do it that way. We removed the top growth and burnt it in a pile. And I think one of the fears would be that if you didn't get a full burn, uh, you could still be leaving disease inoculum in the orchard there. Because sometimes, a plant, like you might think you've got it all burnt, but you lift up a branch and the underneath is still fully sort of untouched or whatever. If
Great.
you had a pile of plants.
Sure.
Okay.
Great.
Did
Thanks
we
for
get
that
them all?
clarification.
Mhm.
Couple more questions. What kind of cover crops are best for in between orchard rows?
Oh, geez. Yeah, we haven't done a lot of experimentation with that. We're using like different orchard grasses and stuff like that, and then also some of the dwarf clover, like I guess sometimes they call it Dutch clover or dwarf clover. Uh, those ones create a pretty decent canopy. It's nitrogen fixing. It kind of competes out a lot of the weeds, so it's easier to manage. With the dwarf clover, you don't have to do the mowing as much versus orchard grass. You're in there having to mow quite regularly, which costs money too. So,
Great.
and we are getting more herbicides registered for these crops. So, even within the row, like I would recommend with Haskap that you grow it in a landscape fabric. Um, that really improved the production and eased management, so you're not dealing with weeds as much. And whatever you want to grow in between is up to you, but just so that you can run equipment through it when you need to. So the grasses tend to be okay that way. If you went to some of the larger crops and larger clovers or things like that, it might be difficult when you want to make those operations. So I would go with the more dwarf clover.
What are your thoughts about wood chips between the berry bushes for Haskaps to reduce the weed growth?
Yeah, and we did that. We tried red colored and just the regular wood chips that aren't colored at all. The red did a little bit better. I don't know if it was a fair trial because they were in different positions. The ones that weren't colored, we were able to get the red colored wood mulch at a cheap price initially, and the other mulch we didn't get until later. So they weren't positioned in the same part of the field. So I don't know if it's an unfair result, but the red wood chip in our trial outperformed the just regular wood chip. Um, but yeah, it worked well. It wasn't as good as the landscape fabric. So yeah.
So could you combine the landscape fabric and the red mulch?
Yeah, you
Okay.
could do that.
Okay.
The thing with landscape fabric is it's very clean too, though, underneath. And so, in terms of cleaning up anything detritus that falls off the plants and stuff like that, it's easier than if you have the wood mulch. Then it creates a little bit of a moisture environment where I think that some things can still thrive or whatever. But that's just speculation, not an experimental fact that I've found.
Okay, understood. Um, in sour cherries, the romance type, how much suckering should you allow?
Uh, I guess it depends what you're doing. If you are just running a U pick or whatever, then the suckering isn't going to be too bad. You can periodically just cut them off, like even in a mowing situation, you can mow it off like it's a grass or something. It's not going to produce much of a problem for you. Um, but if you're doing mechanical harvesting, if that's what you're setting up for, you definitely want to control that growth. And It is a challenge. It's always hard to control suckering. It comes up and it's just part of the plant. That's where partially I was interested in apogee, because if it can have the same sort of impact as it does on strawberries with reducing runnering, if it's priming the plant to say, I don't need to send out, suckers, then that might be a good option for a long-term methodology of controlling that. But there's also some other uh, herbicides that are just their contact. So they're used for suckers in apples, and you can just spray them to the suckers, and it kills the suckers, but it doesn't spread. And the suckers will regrow, but it just kills the top growth. I'm forgetting the name of that product right now. You'll have to excuse my brain, but it'll come to me tonight before I fall asleep or something.
Or while you're in the middle of your sleep.
Yeah.
So is there an ideal amount of time to burn with the torch?
Um, yeah, geez. You know, as they go through, I'm going with the prairie berries experience. It's not an exceptionally long period of time. Like you have to make sure that the flame is coming in at a distance where the most impact is happening. So, like sometimes if you put it too close or if you put it too far away, you're not getting the same burn. So make sure you adjust the nozzles, if you like, to be where the burn is happening the most. And in that, you don't want to go fast, but at your lowest setting for your tractor speed, that's sufficient. So it's only a few seconds. You're just actually rolling over it at a slow pace.
Okay.
But that's a good point. We should have timed exactly how much time the burn was. But as far as I know, nobody took that data. But I've seen them doing it, and just the low setting, the slowest setting on their tractor, and they're just running.
What are the best types of watering from the studies that you did?
Yeah, in terms of Haskap, like with those initial stages of things, it's kind of a complicated thing because we had different levels of natural precipitation, and particularly in 2020, we had a lot of, um, you know, in that particular region anyway, we had a lot of precipitation and timely precipitation. It wasn't like there was a long stretch of time where there wasn't natural rains that happened. So that probably messed up our data a little bit, but just even once a week was sufficient. And although there was a little bit of a difference in terms of growth vigor initially, uh, it didn't pan out to be a difference in terms of yields over the 4-year period. So, yeah. But again, that was in a region that's more like Leduc, Edmonton area. If you're in a zone where you're dealing with sandier soil and you're a little bit warmer or a little bit more sunshine with fewer rains and that sort of thing, less precipitation, then I would say that you probably want, especially in the early years of plant establishment, to have it a little bit more regularly. And we did, like in those initial years, we did see in the first 2 years a difference where even the two-row one was giving an advantage over the single. And that first establishment year was drier, so uh, you know it's a little bit complicated
Okay.
to extract out what's natural and what wasn't.
Yeah. How many questions are left there, Dawn?
One last question.
Okay.
The landscape fabric I had was made of a thick fiberglass. Is that what is recommended?
Oh, no, they use a different, it's sort of a weave type product. Now, I think I ordered it through Dubois Agriculture from Quebec. and it's a particularly strong. I know what you're talking about, that kind of fiberglass stuff, but that tends to be able to tear apart a little bit easier than the weave type product that is really resilient over the years. It stays pretty much exactly as you purchased it for many years. And it's easy to open up little pockets in it because the weave just opens. Uh, but it stays together really nicely. And that's a bit of an advantage over the plastic because over the years, the plastic tends to break, and you'll get deer or elk or whatever else going through your orchard, and they'll punch holes through the plastic. But the landscape fabric, this particular kind of weave type landscape fabric, they didn't damage at all. So
Do you have a brand on that? The same individual is asking what brand
I
that was.
I could send a link. It's Dubois Agriculture. I don't have it in front of me right now, but uh, they sell commercial landscape fabric that you can get in large rolls, and it's relatively inexpensive for what it is.
Great.
I had
Okay.
one pop in about watering. Did you want to cover that one, Sharon, or no?
Sure. Okay, let's wrap up with that one.
That's the last one then. What was there a difference in the method of water drip irrigation as effective as tank watering?
Well, we were doing a fertigation too, so it's not just the irrigation water, but I would say like when you can deliver it through your drip line, it's getting down to the roots, and you're able to have a mulch in there where the water is going underneath the mulch, and so there's less spread of water around and less evapotranspiration. So the water that you are putting down is going to the roots and staying where it's needed because the mulch provides protection and doesn't allow evapotranspiration, especially when it's hot and dry. Because if you're just coming along with the tank and putting water in, well, even while the water is coming out of the nozzle, there's going to be some that's spread around a little bit lost. And so, yeah, I would say that there's advantage. And I didn't really touch on this, but water quality is also extremely important. You need to make sure that you've got the right pH for one thing. Like you want a relatively neutral pH. Uh, the water that comes out of I'm more familiar with the South Saskatchewan River water, but you know it's coming. Our irrigation water sometimes coming out at like 8.9 pH. That's too high. It needs to be brought down to more neutral. And then we add in fertilizers too. So you're getting that delivery of fertilizer as well as water. So there's an advantage that way. Um, and it's not to say you couldn't add in a fertilizer mix. Like you could do your just plain water, provided it's good quality water in a tank. But then every once in a while, you're going to want to mix in some fertilizer probably too. And like with the Haskap, we were, going 2020 mainly, but uh, there are in some soils you might run into some micronutrient deficiencies. So you need to test your soil and look at what your nutrient profile is that you need and come up with that. But then you want to, water soluble type of fertilizer as well. And we usually recommend like the plant prod products. And in Saskatchewan, I recommend people go through. We have a couple different suppliers, but like Early's Farm and Garden has an online presence, and you can order those fertilizers from them. But you probably have UFA might be able to order stuff in for you that way, or I don't know what some of the other Pro Hort or I'm forgetting. There's a couple. I'm sure you have some in Edmonton as well.
Okay, super. All right. Well, maybe we should close off there. I appreciate all the questions. Those were there was a lot there to cover, and sorry everyone for all the hiccups that we encountered. But we really appreciate the, everything that you shared, Forrest, from the beginnings of just basic pruning to, your research and getting down into each of the types of fruit. So that was really great. Thank you so much. If there's anything on the Haskap, was it Haskap variety or selections, Forrest, that anything that
Yeah,
any resources we can touch base after, and you can
for
send us
sure.
any
And people can
resources.
just email me
Sure.
directly. So
Yeah.
like my email address is just my name, Forrest, dot Scharff, so SCHARF at gov.sk.ca.
Okay.
Happy to
Okay.
respond to any questions for sure.
That's great. Okay. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us. I'll have a few comments after we're done, but yeah, we're really grateful for everything that you shared, Forrest, and thank you for everyone's participation. We're really glad that you could join us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for staying with us.